I've got an example in my office that I didn't bring of the use of deletion in visual communication, in visual media, which is very important. Like you take a picture and crop it in the right way, and you've cut out very relevant information. The picture is of two Iranian women, and they're sort of looking down like this. They're wearing everything is covered but their faces, so it's ready to play into all of our stereotypes there about oppressed Iranian women. And they're looking down like this, and it seems as though they're, to use the pattern of mind reading, we can say, well, they are suffering under the burden of Islamist oppression. And then you look at the picture from which this was cropped, and you see that they're looking down at a newspaper. They're actually looking down because they're reading a newspaper. So that's kind of a significant deletion. The meta model also, the meta model, a model of the modeling process, so it's language about language. So it's not only used in questioning in order to get higher quality information, it's in a sense higher quality. If you consider higher quality detail, greater detail and specificity. But when you study the meta model, you're also studying linguistic patterns that are in a sense hypnotic, because they are with the meta model, language shows how it constructs reality in a certain way. And this will become clear as I go along, so maybe I'll say more about it later. I think I'm just going to run through the other patterns right now, or at least initially, because I might run through them again.
Can I ask you a question on hypnotic? What's a hypnotic pattern? It's like when it's embedded in the language that you're going to think a certain way?
Well, that's a good question, but at this point, the answer is that all language is hypnotic insofar as it constructs your reality. As in, your eyes are getting heavier, you're getting sleepy, you know. I have another illustration in the office that I might bring later, which might as well tell you about it now. I call it O'Hanlon's dots. So O'Hanlon is one of the better-known brief therapists in the United States, coming out of California. And in his background, we have NLP, and therefore behind that, general semantics. And he actually uses this in couple therapy. He gives you, this will be 16 dots. Let each dot stand for a fact. We're not going to argue now about what a fact is or how you identify a fact, because there's no end to that either. That's a good thing to know. That's a fact. He shows you, he uses this in couple therapy. You got your husband and your wife, your heterosexual antagonistic symbiosis, and usually we're told that you got to hear both sides of the story, but actually there's, if you look at this, many more than two ways of connecting these dots. You can connect them that way, you can connect them that way, you can connect them that way. So he shows you in the diagram 16 different ways of connecting the dots, all equally plausible. So the line never goes outside here, which would represent implausibility or impossibility. All of these different ways of constructing reality here out of the resources of factual material are, at least in principle, equally plausible, or maybe even we could say equally valid. So there's no one truth there, and there's no two truths either. There's multiple truths. It's a kind of an introduction to many-sidedness. Now, depending on the meta-model patterns that your language is falling into, you are connecting the dots in one way or another. I was thinking a little while ago of a story about Judy Rebick that I saw in the Globe and Mail, and where Judy Rebick praises a young Aboriginal activist for all of her good works. And Rebick says about her, and among her strengths is her ability to connect the dots. And I'm sure you've heard this expression in more than one context, more than once. It's about connecting the dots. No one ever even thinks for a moment about the possibility that there's more than one way of connecting the dots. It's as if the dots were already out there, the connections were already out there in reality, and all you have to do is to see the way that they are connected. So the meta model allows you both to connect the dots in a certain way for certain purposes. For example, if you like to think positive, then you can connect the dots that way. See? You can. You can. If you want to be more realistic and go to an earlier grave, you can think negative and connect the dots that way. And I just use a meta model pattern there called complex equivalence, which I'll talk about in a moment. So anyway, okay, so mind reading is, I mentioned that last time. We couldn't live without mind reading. I mean, we couldn't live, we couldn't communicate, we couldn't be linguistic creatures without meta model patterns. So the idea, again, just as in the structural differential, the idea is not to destroy abstraction, but to be conscious of abstraction. So with the meta model, the idea is not to avoid meta model patterns, because then you would just have to shut up, but to use them with awareness and to use them in the way that we're talking about. So mind reading, the example I used was the communists want to destroy our way of life. Of course, they're in no position to do that anymore, but at the time that that statement was uttered, it seemed like it was a plausible construction of reality. It was plausible. The communists wanted to destroy our way of life. Of course, our is an unspecified referential infix. And the challenge there would be, how do you know? So here the challenge is, which Canadians specifically? And here the challenge was, how specifically do you want, does the ruling class exploit the poor? And here the challenge would be, well, what, which, where, when, how, and what happened before that? Oh, I also mentioned here comparative deletion, a subspecies of deletion where a comparison is deleted. For example, every dictatorship is called a brutal dictatorship. Now they're talking about Duvalier's dictatorship. It takes an earthquake to remind you of a dictatorship. So today they're talking about Duvalier's dictatorship, but it's almost always qualified as a brutal dictatorship, which brings to mind the question, well, compared to what? Brutal oppression? Brutal compared to what other dictatorship? More brutal, less brutal thing? So that's comparative deletion. In a way, the meta model undermines thoughtlessness, if you see what I mean. So mind reading, how do you know that? By the way, every question elicits a response. And then the response itself falls into a meta model pattern. For example, if I ask, how do you know that the communists want to destroy our way of life? The response is most likely to be a complex equivalence. These are tightly linked. We know that the communists want to destroy our way of life because they are assisting rebels in Vietnam. They are assisting the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese war effort in Vietnam. So that's a complex equivalence which works like this. If X, then Y. Or X means Y. And the challenge is, could they be supporting the rebels in North Vietnam without wanting to undermine our way of life? Could X actually not be related in that way to Y? That would be the challenge for complex equivalence. And when I teach the meta model, I teach students to use exactly the words of the formal challenge, as it's called, that I tell them about. Because those formal challenges are designed to elicit information at a lower level, at a lower label level, closer to the object level. If you just challenge it in the same old way that you're interested in, you'll get into an argument which will proceed at the same level and is not likely to get anywhere in terms of eliciting higher quality information. If you stay at the label level and carry out your argument there, which is usually what we do, then what you get is one version or another of "because I said so." And we'll go to our graves knowing what we know because we know it. If you really loved me, you'd buy me a Porsche. That's complex equivalence. If you really loved me, you would buy me a Porsche. So the challenge would be, is it possible that I could love you without buying you a Porsche? Or is it possible that if I buy you a Porsche, it's a sign of hate? So when you question metamodel patterns, those are providing opportunity or possibility for a reconstruction of reality with the kind of easier access to the object level that general semantics was always advocating. The questioning at the label level allows you to go back to the object level, pick up information that you missed or chose not to use or ignored or denied in the first place, and take that back to construct a new formulation at the label levels, and so on in Korzybski's familiar spiral. Modal operator. There's two kinds of modal operators, a modal operator of necessity and a modal operator of possibility. There's a modal operator of possibility that is extremely important in our individual and collective existences, and that is I can't, or we can't. We can't do anything about global warming. It's not a man-made phenomenon. We can't do anything about it. Okay, so the challenge there would be, there's two forms of challenge there. What stops you? I can't get up in the morning. Well, what stops you? I can't stop smoking. Well, what stops you? We can't reimagine the possible. Well, what stops you? And that's a kind of a negative challenge which elicits information about obstacles, which is useful information, surely, but it's nice to know specifically what the obstacles are that are resulting in the belief that I can't, or we can't, or you can't. And the other challenge would be, what would it be like if you could? I can't stop smoking. Well, what would it be like if you could? This is a good example, by the way, of the hypnotic aspect of the metamodel and of language in general. If I ask someone what it would be like if you could, they will get an image of what it would be like. They would, in their imagination, go into that reality and experience it at the object level in their imagination. So if you ask someone, what would it be like if you could stop smoking? And they would go like, I can breathe, I can smell, I can taste, like that. That can be powerful. At the same time, of course, people are usually invested in what Weber called their ideal interests as well as their material interests. Weber thought it was very important to correct Marxism's emphasis on material interests with the notion of ideal interests. In other words, ego investment in a certain way of constructing reality which has a certain relation to one's material interests but is not identical with them. Think of the connection between Protestantism and capitalism, which was so important to Weber. Then there's the modal operator of necessity, which is also very important. And the term of choice these days is need. We used to use words like must, should, have to. Those are all modal operators of necessity. An example of the modal operator of necessity would be we must reward success and punish failure. We must punish failure and reward success. We must punish failure and reward success. We must reward success and punish failure. And what would happen if we didn't? What would happen if we didn't is the challenge to a modal operator of necessity. What would happen if we didn't reward success and punish failure? And the answer is something like a complex equivalence. Well, if we didn't reward success, no one would have any motivation to do anything. And if we didn't punish failure, then people would just fail all the time. In other words, the underlying belief is that the only reason that people will do anything is to obtain rewards and avoid punishment, which is basically Benthamism, right?
Skinnerism.
And
There's
Skinnerism.
consequences
Sure.
too,
Yeah.
which is back to Hobbes.
Which is what?
Hobbes as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Hobbes is the granddaddy of this. He was personally familiar with it as kind of the Hobbesian gospel. So modal operator of possibility is challenged with what stops you and what would it be like if you could? And modal operator of necessity is, well, what would happen if we did? Or what would happen if we didn't? You must not do that. Well, what would happen if I do? Well, I would, punch you in the stomach, right? So there's a complex equivalence. Well, if, then. So you're beginning to get the idea of how one leads to another and how they're all sort of, at least potentially interrelated in their capacity to construct a sort of reality. And how they are...
Of our students.
So the modal operator of necessity is what would happen if we didn't. The best examples of the meta model are short statements of a few sentences which pack a lot of patterns in on one another, which pack them all in together so that it's really hard to see what's going on. Now, the way I'm talking about it, I'm talking about it as if it's a set of tricks. But again, I repeat, it's not a set of tricks, it's inherent in the structure of the language. So you could say, well, the language itself is tricky. Language is a trick. So it's not right-wing language or left-wing language. And it's not even language in itself. It's Aristotelian language that we're after here. That is, language that is not conscious of itself as language, as what language is, which is abstraction from the object level, which is abstraction from the event level. Cause-effect. Usually when I give tasks, which I'm not going to do, by the way, there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who love the meta model and internalize it and hear it in their heads sort of all the time about their own language and others. And there's others who hate the meta model and want to forget about it as soon as possible. And when I said that, I just constructed reality so that you have to choose one of those two options. And it's a two-value kind of structure. Which, by the way, if we were constructing a different version of the meta model, we could choose to identify a pattern corresponding to Korzybski's two-valued evaluation, either or. It's actually a kind of complex equivalence, if you think about it. Either Jesus was telling the truth, or he is a liar. That's like, if Jesus was not telling the truth, then he is a liar. So there's you can see the two-valued structure there. Cause-effect. Well, let's see what I have here. Disrespecting people makes them angry. Very often, if not always, the word makes me. You make me mad. See what you made me do. Disrespecting people makes them angry. Well, the challenge here is how specifically does it make them angry, with emphasis on the make. Like, is there any room for choice there? Do I have to get angry when I'm disrespected? Like, in Gandhi's India, if you disrespected Gandhi, would it make him angry? We'll talk about that later. But if you disrespect a certain variety of Hindu nationalists, it would make him angry, and he would shoot Gandhi in the head, and Gandhi would forgive him as he slumped dead to the ground. So does disrespecting people make them angry? Now, you make me angry, But if you ask me how specifically do I make you angry, then I've got to go back to the object level, my own experience, and find out what it was. And I might find out something as ridiculous and implausible as that it was your tone of voice. And that I have a sort of conditioned reflex, I'm going to be talking about soon, conditioned reflex type of reaction to a mere tone of voice. Well, it's like when you use that tone of voice, complex equivalence, I know that you're about to do something horrible. See how they're packed together there? Well, is it possible that when I use that tone of voice, it doesn't mean anything other than that it's that tone of voice, and that perhaps I have a stomach ache, and that it doesn't mean anything about my state of mind in particular. All right, so here we're in the heterosexual antagonistic symbiosis scene again, but you can see how this kind of thing could be a double-edged sword in relationships, the meta model, because it can be used for, let's say, constructive processing. It could also be used for destructive relationship destruction. Of course, that is sometimes the name of the game.
But that can also be queer too, right?
It can also be queer, of course. Yeah. I use heterosexual often as a synonym for queer.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's like heterosexuals against Israeli apartheid. Or something like that. Oh yeah, well there's the old lost performative, which I did talk about last time. Just easy to identify. You're also beginning to notice how many statements in the language fall under more than one pattern. So you've got to choose which pattern to challenge. Maybe all that you can see, or maybe one that's going to be particularly fruitful in getting higher quality information or constructing a saner reality. We'll go back to brutal again, okay? Brutal oppression. Well, brutal according to whom? And brutal according to what criteria? So those are the challenges. So you're going to find out a lot about oppression if you ask the question according to whom and according to what criteria. You're going to find out a lot about the way oppression, the term, the word oppression is used. A lot about how to do things with words. How to use the word oppression in order to do all kinds of really interesting things. It's not usually the oppressor who uses the term oppression. We can just start out that way and get increasingly confused as we go along. Now here there are two really sort of deep patterns. One of them is the presupposition. Presupposition is fun. It's the only one of these that is really fun, lost performative. Fun according to whom? According to me. Fun according to what criteria? Well, it makes me smile and laugh. Complex equivalence, or maybe cause-effect. Well, is it possible that it could make you smile and laugh without being funny? I think so. So, presupposition. You can see how you can use the meta model to lose friends. If you have too many friends, just use the meta model in the right tone of voice, and you'll soon be free. Free at last. Presupposition. Okay, so here we have a statement. The black community must take responsibility for its problems. I'm going to come back to this statement later and identify different patterns there. Let's just work on this, okay, in terms of presupposition. In this sentence, it is presupposed that there is a black community. The black community must take responsibility for its problem. The little word the often introduces a presupposition. The black community presupposes, I shouldn't say assumes, because there's a difference between an assumption and a presupposition. The presupposition can be identified by anyone who looks at the sentence. In other words, it's right there in the structure of the language. There's no room for debate. So it goes beyond implication or something that I think is an assumption. If I can't identify it in the structural language, and I'll show you how in a second you can do that. Well, basically you ask yourself, would the sentence make any sense at all without that statement? So this statement, the black community must take responsibility for its problems, wouldn't make any sense if there were no such thing as the black community, the black community. So in this way we can identify it as a presupposition that there is a black community. There's also presupposition that there is such a thing as responsibility, or there are such things as problems. A lot of presuppositions are kind of necessary and innocent. Those aren't, but we'll get to them in a moment. Well, it's also presupposed there that it has problems. The little word it. See how easy it is to discuss the metamodal patterns as though they were crimes. But again, I repeat, it's inherent in the structural language. And if you're asking these questions, it's easy to fall into a kind of prosecutorial mode. But really, we're just looking for information. So, well, how do you know that there is such a thing as a black community, would be the question. How do you know that there is such a thing as the black community? Last time I looked around at the object level, there was a Haitian, a Jamaican, a Trinidadian, an ex-American, a Nigerian, a Ghanaian, a Somalian, an Ethiopian, etc., etc. Where is the black community? Well, I could say there is a pan-black Metro Toronto Council of self-appointed leaders of the black community. Well, okay, if that's what you want to call the black community, we can go on with the discussion from there. I really don't know how much the Nigerians have in common with the Guyanians, but operative there is I really don't know. I really don't know. Apart from the color of their skin. So, what was the highlight of the holidays for you? What's the presupposition? What's the presupposition? What was the highlight of the holidays for you? Seems like an innocent question. Well, it is innocent, but it has a presupposition. The presupposition is that there was a highlight. What was the highlight of the holidays for you? There's others in there, but that's the one you want to challenge. Like, before you asked me that question, there was no highlight. I mean, there was this. I enjoyed it all, or I hated it all, or whatever. When you ask me what was the highlight, I search at the object level for something that will stand as the highlight. And I've constructed the reality of my holidays such that that was the highlight, and then that's what it is. That's what it was. It's like false memory. It's not a false memory. It's a selected memory. But I can work with presuppositions to install a false memory too. I can repeat like 100 times the question, well, what was it like when he beat you? Well, what was it like when he beat you? Well, what was it like when he beat you? I'm getting images of him beating me, and pretty soon I've got a false memory of him beating me. Well, there's a good example of the hypnotic power of language. The presuppositions are probably the most hypnotic pattern. What is most disgusting about communism? Presupposes that there's a list of disgusting things, and then you can find the most disgusting thing about communism. Just a constant repetition of a word which we all know about from our propaganda studies, but we're looking here at something deeper than propaganda and more universal than propaganda. What is most disgusting about communism? Well, the way it brutally oppresses the Ukrainian petty bourgeoisie. Well, how specifically does it oppress? Brutally oppress the Ukrainian petty bourgeoisie, and brutal compared to what? Well, it's because Stalin starved them out. And then, well, you know, okay, you get the idea. Russia's brutal occupation of Chechnya should end. By the way, has Russia's brutal occupation of Chechnya ended? Putting any kind of qualifier in front of a word like brutal, and then if you can back it up with a the, it constructs a pretty powerful presupposition. If I say the socialist project of controlling our every breath, okay, presupposes that there is a socialist project and that it's aimed at mind reading also. at controlling our every breath. The commissar under every bed to supervise our sex lives, to make sure that they're, Did you know there was a commissar under your bed?
Not every night.
Or what about the nice old lady? Well, look at that nice old lady over there. Was like when you go to the store, buy me a Porsche, it presupposes that I will go to the store. It's very different from go to the store and buy me a Porsche. That's a command. When you go to the store, buy me a Porsche just presupposes that I will go to the store. When am I more likely to go to the store? When you say when, or if you omit the when? When a command is framed as a presupposition, it is less likely to evoke resistance. When you say to your little kid, would you like to go to bed now, or would you like to go to bed 5 minutes from now, then you're presupposing that he would like to go to bed. And it works as often as it doesn't. The use of the word when. Of course, the kid could be too smart for that. When she is angry, she is beautiful. Presupposes that she is at least sometimes angry. Look at that fuzzy bear. If I say, look at that fuzzy bear, I presuppose that there's a fuzzy bear over there that you can see, and maybe some of you can actually see it at this very moment. Because I told you to. Whether I can see it or not. I am afraid that Dorothy will be as lazy as her Uncle Adolf. Presupposes that Adolf is lazy. I am afraid that Dorothy will be as lazy as her Uncle Adolf. Do you see why presuppositions are fun? Presuppose that Adolf is lazy. Well, for whom are they fun, according to what criteria? Well, what other presupposition is in there? Can you see it? Can you hear it? I think that Dorothy will be as lazy as her Uncle Adolf. I'm afraid that Dorothy will be as lazy as her Uncle Adolf. It presupposes that Dorothy isn't already as lazy as her Uncle Adolf. Okay, so presuppositions are fun.
Especially when you do a dance with them.
Well, especially when you dance with presuppositions. Yeah, Horowitz dances with presuppositions. The challenge is, how do you know? How do you know that? How do you know that her Uncle Adolf is lazy? How do you know that she isn't already as lazy as her Uncle Adolf? Here's when that combines mind reading and presupposition. And this is so common in the queer symbiosis. It presupposes, if I say, why are you so angry? That presupposes what?
You are angry.
Then you are angry. Right. It also presupposes that there are readily identifiable reasons. Why are you so, well, I guess it doesn't actually presuppose that, but it does presuppose that you're angry. That's my sister-in-law's favorite way of calming you when you're having a dispute with her. You know? My sister-in-law was once having a little tiff with Shannon. Shannon was quite indignant, and I said to my sister-in-law, maybe you should go and sort of make up with her. So my sister-in-law, Tara, went over to Shannon and said, Shannon, why are you so angry?
Shannon, what's the matter with you?
Lost in translation.
So what's the matter with you, presupposing that there's something the matter? What's the matter with you? Which I heard from my father at least twice a week when I was a teenager. And the more often I heard it, the more there was something the matter. And it was his question. Another way of looking at presuppositions, and then maybe I should move on. Yes, very soon I should move on. I'll leave nominalizations, the final pattern, until next time. In some ways it's the most difficult because it's the pattern that changes a process into a thing, which is perhaps the most deeply embedded metamal pattern in Aristotelian language. But for now, one way of identifying presuppositions is to think of it in terms of embedded statements, one statement embedded in another like that. So that, for example, now everybody knows this. There's some kind of mind reading going on there. Everybody knows is mind reading. How do I know what everybody knows? Or that everybody knows this? But everybody knows. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So these truths are in here. If we diagram a statement this way, by using this kind of boxes, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Just two boxes needed there. See, the ones in the inside box are presupposed. We presuppose that there are these truths. All we're saying is that they are self-evident. So then the argument among philosophers, for example, becomes whether they are self-evident or not, rather than whether they are truths in any truthful sense of the term truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So presupposition can be a form of red herring, in a way, to distract attention from the operative part to a less important part of the statement and to focus the debate on that. But again, we can't use language without presuppositions. So the important thing is to be aware of presuppositions. And here's the other example of the use of, it's not just that the enemies of freedom use presupposition. Oh no. No. Oh, this also only needs two boxes. Didn't you see the flashing red light? If you're a driver, then the person who sits in the death seat beside you will often raise questions like that. Didn't you see that stop sign? Presupposition, there's a stop sign there. The only question is whether I saw it or not. There was no stop sign there. But when you said, didn't you see that stop sign? I imaged it, and I said, no, I didn't see it. And so he could then say, well, what's the matter with you? Are you blind or something? And we could go on from there. Or even if there was a stop sign there. The question is, some other question anyway, will get us further at that moment in the relationship. So that's a set of Chinese boxes with smaller sentences hidden inside larger ones. Our attention is captured by the larger box, and the smaller one becomes presupposed. How often have you heard this one? Let's look at the big picture. Presupposes that there is the big picture. The big picture. One big picture. Let's look at the big picture. It also presupposes that we aren't already looking at it. Again, you can identify it by asking, would the sentence make sense without it? If it's a mere implication, the sentence would make sense without it. Implications can be powerful, but they're not structures of language. They're not structures inherent in language. Or maybe they are. But they're not in the meta model. Canadians, like all other human beings, continue to be engaged by essential spiritual questions. Well, which Canadian specifically? Oh, like all other human beings is universal quantifier. I always forget it because it's always so forgettable. But it's allness. Canadians, like all other human beings. What? All? So the challenge to the universal quantifier is all. It's just the question. All other human beings? Continue to be engaged by essential spiritual questions presupposes that there are such things as essential spiritual questions. If there are such things as spiritual questions, that there are such things as essential spiritual questions, and that Canadians have been engaged by them in the past, because otherwise we couldn't use the word continue to be engaged by essential spiritual questions. Well, here's a good one which comes from Bill Roberts, the CEO of Vision TV, Toronto. Do we still have a Vision TV, Toronto? How would you guys know?
Is that like religious one?
Yeah.
It's like pan-religious.
Yes. And how often have you had to sort of get flummoxed and perplexed when you heard a question like this? Who created this world? which presupposes that someone did. What is our purpose here? Which presupposes that we have a purpose here. And how do the answers to these questions help us to lead moral and civil lives? Which presupposes that the answer to the question, who created the world, helps us to lead moral and civil lives. Right? So, what if Big Bird created the world? How would that help us to lead moral and civil lives?
Well, Big Bird's a great teacher of virtues like sharing.
I knew there would be an answer. Do you think it's a good idea for you to be doing that? I just love these. I have to continue. Presupposes that I'm doing it. Do you think it's a good idea for you to do that? This one combines presupposition with mind reading. If you knew how I suffer, you wouldn't be doing that to me. Again, this is an essential tool in the life of a couple. If you knew how I suffer, you wouldn't be doing that to me. So mind reading that you don't know how I suffer. Presupposition that I suffer. And you wouldn't be doing that to me presupposes that you are doing that to me. This is maybe my favorite, because we're getting close to Burke and then we'll go on. Life magazine, in a poll, asks its readers, when you think about God, what do you see? Which presupposes that I think about God. When you think about God, what do you see? Which presupposes that when I think about God, I see something, which is, an offense against at least two of the major three monotheistic religions. Because in Judaism and Islam, we don't see a damn thing when we think about God. We hear slightly different commands, though. Slightly different. Well, but my favorite is from the greatest blah blah artist of all time, Edmund Burke. And, of course, Edmund Burke is Bob Ray's favorite philosopher.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. Didn't you know that? Bob Ray says Edmund Burke is his favorite philosopher. I think it's because he hurried through Paul 3:20 and didn't get that Burke was not an evolutionary socialist. No, Burke was a progressive conservative. A progressive conservative. And here's Burke. The awful author of our being is the author of our place in the order of existence. Notice the continuous use of that innocent little the article. The awful author of our being is the author of our place in the order of existence. Presupposes that there is an author of our being, that the author of our being is an awful, presupposes it. The awful author of our being is the author of our place, which presupposes that we have a place, a preordained by God place. The author of our place in the order of existence presupposes that there is an order of existence. So the stacking of presuppositions is very powerful. It is seductive. And when you hear that, in effect, there is an awful author of your being, and he is the author of your place in the order of existence, so you better just suck it up and forget about Rancière and all other, agitators. This also, by the way, just by chance, this formulation identifies multi-ordinal levels. My being, the awful author of my being, my place in society, at a higher multi-ordinal level, and the cosmos, the order of existence. So those three levels are identified. The awful author of my being is the author of my place in society, and he goes on to explain how the social contract is just a small paragraph in the awful cosmic contract of all beings from the beginning to the end of time. If you remember Reflections on the Revolution in France, I think you should read it once a month as a kind of homeopathic remedy for Toryism. God made me a millionaire presupposes that there is a God and that's a cause effect. God made me a millionaire. I have no choice. I must go on, I just can't help it. Are 50 Canadian soldiers' lives too high a price to pay for bringing democracy to Afghanistan? Presupposes that we're bringing democracy to Afghanistan. Right? And then we'll just argue about whether 50 Canadian soldiers' lives are too high, or maybe it would be 500 that would be too high. That's what we would argue about. We need to strike a balance between security and human rights. Presupposes that there's a trade-off between security and human rights, and we need to find the balance. Is creativity primarily a collective or a solitary activity? The debate was advertised at Hart House. I picked it up from the poster. So those of you who are into debates or debating as a form of life. Is creativity primarily a collective or a solitary activity? Presupposes that it's got to be either collective or solitary or some kind of combination of collective and solitary rather than Mobius, collective and solitary. For example, think of Mozart and Vienna. Okay? Was Mozart's creativity primarily a solitary activity, or was it primarily a collective activity? I just leave you with that. No Vienna, no Mozart. So, it's hard to say there which comes first. But there's this other thing from Burke. Maybe I'll leave you with this one. Look at, this is from therapy training. You're being trained to be a therapist. And one therapist says to you, maybe he's a kind of mad Freudian. Maybe he is a kind of mad Freudian. He says to you, actually a Freudian of any kind would never say this to you. But this therapist would say, I want you to get fully in touch with the latent and uncontrollable destructive feelings seething within you. As opposed to, now as you get in touch with your capacity to choose out of all the resources that you have at this moment, those that would work best for you. So they're both presuppositions, and yet the realities that are immediately constructed in the moment by these two alternatives are quite different. We're going to go on to parts of the Spirit Course which make hardly any reference any longer to Korzybski or General Semantics, but just presuppose it in the background of our approach. So I suggested that in General Semantics we may have something like a premonitory model. I talked about that last time. Why should I repeat this? What I'll do here is move along and say that if we take another look at Korzybski's notion of semantic blocks, because I talked last time about animal righteousness as the human form of violence. It's animal righteousness. It's the human form because animals don't indulge in righteousness. But humans love righteousness. They love their own righteousness, and they hate the lack of righteousness in others. And that sums up a lot of the problem of violence for human beings. Because I'm not saying that violence is all wrong all the time. I'm just saying that violence is a problem for human beings, and that a fundamentally different orientation to violence is an essential aspect of a quantum leap in the evolution of human sanity. So if we take another look at Korzybski's notion of semantic blocks, we find something surprising and even remarkable. And hey, I'm going to stall a bit because I wish Albert was here right now, because this is his third go-around in the course, but these are thoughts that I just had last week, you see. Because if you stay with something and you're alive, the spiral will go on. And my own position on violence has changed quite a bit since I first started teaching the Spirit Course. I've become more violent and more tolerant of violence. And it's very difficult for me to, I'm going to avoid the parts that give me trouble, but if I just sailed through my notes as I have in the past, I would find myself tripping over myself in terms of changes that have been going on in my own orientation. But, you know, I'm not going to bother you with that. We'll have to work it out first. I mean, there's such a thing. Some people think that teaching is best when it's like the teacher is thinking out loud or thinking with the students. Well, that may be true for other teachers, but not so much for moi.
I think it's good if you've done the reading.
Yes, it's good if you've done the reading. So Albert, I was saying that I've recently come up with the notion that for Korzybski, and I found this somewhat surprising, that for Korzybski the intentional orientation, which overvalues conceptualization, and conceptualization relies on the cortical levels of the brain nervous system, is actually Mobiused, and I don't have to explain what I mean by that here, Mobiused with violent emotionality. Korzybski speaks of thalamic overload. That's a term I've never used before in channeling Korzybski, and it'll be useful in this connection, thalamic overload. And it works this way. So here's one way of diagramming semantic blockage. The transmission from the object level to the label levels is blocked. That stands for blockage. The transmission from the object to the label levels is blocked. That is, let's use the language of brain science, 1933. The transmission from thalamus to the cortex is blocked. So that means that information from the object levels of sensory experience inside and outside the skin, including emotional feelings, cannot reach the cortex. Now that we've already seen in first term. Sensory experience can't reach the cortex. So, and this is the next step, the thalamus is overloaded. This is what I haven't seen or ascribed enough importance to before. The thalamus is overloaded with feelings which are denied cortical organization, summation, integration, etc. The thalamus is overloaded with feelings which are denied cortical summation, organization, and integration. Thus, apparently paradoxically, the cortex is actually underused in the regime which overvalues it. The cortex is actually underused, Korzybski's term, underused, in the very regime which overvalues the cortex. In other words, the two blocks from thalamus to cortex and cortex to thalamus are strictly correlative. When I've taught this material before, I talked about it as if there were two separate forms of semantic block that usually went together, but I'm putting it more strongly this time. They always go together, necessarily go together. They are, strictly speaking, correlative. So in the very humanity which, since Aristotle has overvalued conceptuality, conceptuality is actually underused. In the humanity which overvalues its human brain, the human brain, the specifically human aspects of the brain, the cortical levels are underused. I can't revise or delay my semantic reaction. There's no pause. If we have this block, then there is no pause. Now look at this. If there is no pause, no gap, no space across which the information can be transmitted, then the cortex and thalamus are actually jammed together. And thalamus is overloaded. Label and object levels are jammed together or fused, or in the language with which we're most familiar, identified. Label is identified with object. Thus, there's no gap or space, or as Korzybski says, delay. There's no delay, which makes for transmission from one level to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other. And that spiral is paused, in the other sense of the word pause. Now, Korzybski wants practice with with a structural differential, and with the devices, and with silent practice, to enable conscious attention to sensory experience and feelings inside and outside the skin, conscious attention to the level where we live. Okay, so if I practice with a structural differential, etc., and I pay conscious attention because it's the cortex that provides conscious attention, and if I pay conscious attention to sensory experience, I'm opening up that pause and removing the blocks. Two different diagrams with which I attempt to illustrate the identity of intentional orientation and thalamic overload. I always used to wonder what the difference was between the cerebro-thalamic pause that Korzybski talks about and cerebro-thalamic integration, which he also talks about. In fact, at some point he uses the term the highly prized or the highly valued cortico-thalamic integration. Now I see that they are the same. When you've got the pause, then you've got the integration. When you've got the jamming, then you've got the disintegration. Because two things that are jammed together are not integrated. It's conscious attention to sensory experience, continuous silent practice from first term. Self-observation is another term we could use here. Continuous practice and self-observation, which activates the cortex and opens that pause, that psychological delay, and makes for cerebro-thalamic integration because each has time to relate to the other, a fraction of a second of psychological delay. Each has time to relate to the other since they are no longer jammed together. And in Korzybski's words, conscious attention to the object level unloads thalamic material onto the cortex. When I read that first, years ago, that we want to unload thalamic material onto the cortex, I just went, and this is what we all have to do. Well, I don't understand that, so I just pass over it right now, if you don't mind. So I think I understand it now, that the thalamic material that was overloading the thalamus and thus leading to violent emotionality, etc., is unloaded onto the cortex, so the cortex can handle it, so the cortex is no longer underused. So I also find it amazing that Korzybski is actually discovering here something like Buddhist mindfulness, his own form of it, I think, and relating it to his own concerns. And if he didn't know anything about mindfulness meditation, I find this a particularly remarkable and pleasing coincidence. And I really don't think that he knew anything about Southern Buddhist mindfulness meditation in 1933, but I could be wrong. He could have had some contact with that information and then sort of chosen not to reveal it. In those introductory pages of Science and Sanity, where he's quoting all those great scientists and philosophers upon whose authority he wanted to rely, I don't think that D.T. Suzuki would have sat very well in there with some of those others. You could get away with that today, but maybe not in 1933 or 43 or even 53. Because in 53, only the beatniks were involved with this kind of thing. So look at that. Look at this. Isn't this remarkable? Until this moment, as good Western philosophers, we just presupposed that there is a kind of violent struggle between reason and the passions, or some kind of necessary balance necessary between reason and the passions. That perhaps we have been too passionate and we should be more rational, or perhaps that we have been too rational and we should be more passionate, and that reason was essential for controlling the passions, and that passion was important in enlivening or enchanting, perhaps, our reason. And now we find out that they're Mobiused, and that it really would be helpful, although these formulations aren't simply wrong by any means. They're kind of premonitions, you might say, of a post-Aristotelian version thereof. We'd be well advised, as they say, to find some other structure of language with which to consider these problems. And I think that contemporary thinkers and philosophers are struggling real hard to find a way through this without much success that I would be willing to recognize as such. So look, the more we look into domination by the concept, by generalizations, by inattention to the particular, the more we find animal righteousness, moralism, the rationalization of selfishness and cruelty. Well, you could check similarity with Adorno, the dialectic of enlightenment, and maybe especially the authoritarian personality. You could check into that, and you'd find all kinds of resonances. But Adorno could use these formulations. Like people who want to learn from Adorno and take his work further could learn from these formulations about the dialectic that Adorno is concerned with, the dialectic of enlightenment, enchantment, and disenchantment, and so forth. So here the Polish engineer is stumbling on a kind of dialectic of enlightenment. But he also offers practices for getting out of it. And the practices that he offers for getting out of it, or at least moving away from it, the dialectic of enlightenment, the practices that he offers are nowhere near anything that even the best of negative dialecticians could have come up with, because they're too smart, too clever to come up with mere practices, or it would be too new agey. And I think it's also important to notice that we're not talking here about a victory of the left over the right. So radical general semantics is not about a victory of the left, whatever that is, a presupposed single left, over the right, whatever that is. It's about, I used to call it a quantum leap in development of sanity or in the evolution of human civilization. Well, on both sides of this dialectic, we will find a kind of bipolar marriage that I talked about in first term. It's also a kind of bipolar thing, but my formulation has changed a little bit in the month since we last talked about it. Since when have you suffered a teacher changing his formulations in mid-course that way, in mid-stream? It's simply because I'm not being paid and I don't give a shit.
Albert would probably be here anyway, though. But
we find this marriage of certainty and confusion that I talked about last time. The marriage of certainty and confusion. The more certain they are, the more confused they are. And as we'll see when we talk about hate, soon we'll talk about hate. This is very closely related to the matter of violence and hatred, the marriage of certainty and confusion. Because what I'm not talking about yet is fear. But I will. To be intolerant of uncertainty is to rocket back and forth between rigidity and frantic confusion. Rigidity and frantic confusion. I don't think there's such a thing as confusion that doesn't have at least an element of the frantic in it. So this Mobius, now here I move on to magic, what I call magic. Maybe I'll find a better rubric under which to discuss this. I'll pause in a moment for questions about these new formulations. You know, I'm sure they could be improved on, not that we have Not that I want to take much time now for improving them, because I want to assimilate them a little bit more before, I want the cortex to work on it a little bit more before I change it again, hey? I mean, there's a lot to be said for change, but there's also something to be said for stability. Marriage, this kind of human marriage of the intentional orientation with animal righteousness and violent emotionality is most clearly seen at the level of language and its effects in what I call magic. Of course, magic 1 is not the same as magic 2, and as we'll maybe find a different term for it. Well, magic is the form of copying animals. By the way, Adorno also touches on this when he talks about animism, the animism in the first stages of the development of the dialectic of enlightenment. But we're concerned with something related, but actually quite different here, where symbols are taken as identical with experience, with sensory experience, in a physiologically, emotionally overloaded manner. I'll unravel this for you. Let's say, for example, that I come in here, I walk in here, and I draw a swastika on the board. And you're already feeling a little bit, uh-oh, right? And what if I go further and I go like this? Okay? Marks on the board. Chalk dust. Pink chalk dust. At the pure object level, that's what we have there. Pink chalk dust. And yet already my hormones are roiling. The testosterone level is rising. And I'm ready for war. That's magic. Violent animal emotions aroused by symbols which would be meaningless to Fido. Although we could condition Fido to respond to those symbols, we'd have to do a lot of behavioral conditioning work. Words like, say, apartheid, hurt. Words hurt, arouse fear and anger, and they arouse fear and anger because they are meant to arouse fear and anger. So when someone talks to me about Israeli apartheid, I do a little bit of mind reading, and I say, those people are trying to hurt me with that analogy, or with that metaphor, or with that identity. They're meant to hurt, and they do hurt. So we're talking here about something that is way pre-Aristotelian. It's way pre-Aristotelian. And it's taken up into language in the Aristotelian orientation and substantially, elevated in some sense in the Aristotelian orientation. And the task is to take it one step further into a non-Aristotelian orientation. And this is where all those approaches of general semantics will, one hopes, turn out to have a certain relevance, if not usefulness. I didn't get this from Korzybski, but he easily could have used it. You're asked to write your name down on a piece of paper and then tear it up. In one version of the Spare Course, were you there? I asked people to write their names down on a piece of paper. Write your name down on a piece of paper. They write their names down on a piece of paper and they say, now tear it up. And then you could ask them, okay, you passed that one well enough, now write your mother's name down on a piece of paper and tear that up. See how you do with that. Or if you're a Christian, write down the name of God, which is Jesus Christ. Write that down on a piece of paper and tear it up slowly and deliberately. Okay, so what we have here is magic at work. And all this stuff about the images of the Prophet Muhammad and the attempted murder of the cartoonist, and are related to this. But every time a swastika appears on a synagogue, the Jews, unspecified referential index, freak out, unspecified verb. Yeah. In fact, once when I was director of a Zionist Hebrew-speaking children's camp 50 miles north of Winnipeg, Winnipeg Beach, there are a lot of Jewish summer residents in Winnipeg Beach, and one year a red swastika appeared on the little white synagogue. Yeah, and they panicked and they all moved into the same large house so they would all be together, and there were headlines in the Winnipeg Tribune and Winnipeg Free Press, government investigation. Hey, it's just a mark. But it's a problem because the mark is telling you about the intentions of others. The mark is telling you that others are out to get you, and they want you to know they're out to get you, and you better give up or surrender or get out, Juden raus. So the mark carries all this information. So we're not talking about something that is simply irrational. Hey, we're talking about one of the essential elements of war. That's violence. Fighting words, as one U.S. Supreme Court justice called them. That's where free speech ended for him, at the border where words passed over into fighting words. Well, okay. Korzybski kept a roll of toilet paper on his desk at the palatial offices of the Institute of General Semantics on Fifth Avenue in New York, which he was able to purchase because a wealthy beneficiary of General Semantics psychotherapy had given him the money. So there was this headquarters of the Institute on Fifth Avenue, New York. It's long gone. And Korzybski was in there in a well-furnished room, I'm sure, and well-dressed as the count that he was, the Pan Korzybski. And people would come in to see him, and they would see a roll of toilet paper on his desk. And they would be, in 1934, 35, and even today, many people would be somewhat offended or perplexed, or they'd be doing a lot of mind reading, like what kind of a person keeps a roll of toilet paper on his desk. This is from the General Semantics Bulletin, Volume 51, 1984, page 17. Well, he used it as Kleenex. Now, possibly growing up in a society with a paper shortage, it's no big deal anyway. But why do you suppose he did that? After he realized that, at least after he realized that it was arousing negative feelings in potential benefactors, he nevertheless kept it on his desk for a while because he wanted them to learn to distinguish what he calls in the Science of Sanity, and I haven't made much of this, signal reactions from symbol reactions. When my semantic reaction is consciously symbolic, I know that I'm reacting to a symbol. I'm sort of conscious of abstraction in that way. When I see the swastika, I don't immediately, burst into. I don't immediately rush to join the Jewish Defense League. Something comes up, but there's enough of a space between cortex and thalamus for me so that I can notice the reaction coming up and sort of choose or decide, hey, we'll just live with this for a while and see what happens. In a signal reaction, one reacts to symbols as though they were identical with whatever they bring to mind. Sort of like a conditioned reflex. And he does talk there a little bit about conditioned reflexes, and a lot of people were talking about Pavlov in those days also. The word rose, or he talks about a paper rose, which some people are allergic to roses, and they'll sneeze at the thought of a rose, or when they're presented with a silk rose, they will sneeze. Okay? That's a signal reaction. Directly identifying map and territory without any what's the word? without any degree of freedom whatsoever to distinguish between the two. This is the structure of a lot of phobic human reactions and behaviors. When animals have a phobia, they have a damn good reason for it. Like, for example, when I mistakenly kicked Asher's dog Molly and caused her a significant degree of pain, she learned to be a little bit phobic of me, and still is for quite some time. We are dealing here with the same kind of magic as is involved in our stereotypical voodoo image of sticking pins in the effigy of a person. And we've been told a million times that if you know that someone is sticking pins in an image of you, in a little doll representing you, you may actually suffer some physical consequences. At least I've heard that, and I don't have a great deal of difficulty believing it. So does anyone know what canola was called before it got that name?
I'm growing up in a farm.
Yes, it used to be called rapeseed. And so they changed it to canola. Now, you could laugh about political correctness here. So we're verging on issues that get some people hot and amuse other people greatly, but they're just the tip of an iceberg, tip of the iceberg of war. Yeah.
We'd be driving to school when I was younger, and we'd pass through fields because I grew up in the countryside, and my mom used to roll down the windows and say, "Oh, I can smell the rain."
Well, she was doing some general semantics training with you, very sarcastically.
Actually, I think it's still called rapeseed in the U.S.
Is it?
I think so.
Well, they're really brutal down there.
To our American viewers, we love you.
Dogfish and catfish were hard to sell in Denmark. But catfish then sold very well as cutlet fish. In West Africa, dogfish sold as fish 45, high in protein, and sold very well. And people don't want to eat dogs or cats, so they don't want to eat dogfish or catfish. So you change the name. Well, maybe instead of changing the name, you could just raise their sanity level. Would it hurt? Well, it might hurt sales a little bit.
Catfish is good.
Now here's my maybe my favorite story here as a teaching tool. It's about the flag. When I say, by the way, the flag, what comes to mind?
National flag.
Sorry?
For me, it's American flag.
The American flag. I was thinking that. This is a very strange country that we live in, where when I say the flag, people think of the American flag.
Yeah, I was saying.
Sorry?
Sorry.
Well, you are American.
Yeah.
Oh, well, then it's a failed experiment.
If it helps,
Yeah.
I have the same initial semantic reaction, and I think it's just a matter of all the American television
Of
signals
course.
talking about the flag, the flag.
Yeah.
To the point that Canadians always say, our flag,
That's right.
or the Canadian flag.
Yeah. Or the maple leaf flower logo.
Yes,
Yeah.
or the red marijuana leaf.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so this is from Etc., the General Semantics Journal, so we know it's a true story. A popular, highly regarded high school teacher stomps on the U.S. flag in class. He was teaching his students to be aware of their semantic reactions. Maybe he was explicitly teaching general semantics. He wanted them to become aware of their semantic reaction as it comes up. If you're aware of it, then you're using the cortex. You're unloading thalamic material on the cortex. You're opening up this pause between cortical organization and thalamic sensory experience. Identifying, well, what they found was, of course, that they were identifying the flag with everything that it means to them, verbally and pre-verbally. So when you stomp on the flag, you're stomping on everything that it means. Freedom, equality, justice, judging a person by the content of his character rather than by the color of his skin, being the best that you could possibly be. When you're stomping on the flag, you're stomping on all of that. Or according to one conservative political theorist who I just came across discussing the vexing American problem of flag burning, Conservatives take it as an assault on all the practices and procedures through which a society constantly defines and redefines itself. So when you burn a flag, I mean, I guess that would be a lot worse than stomping on a flag. Hey, you're stomping on a piece of cloth with colored designs on it, or burning the aforementioned object. But when you're doing that, according to this conservative, it's an assault on all, universal quantifier, all the practices and procedures through which a society constantly defines and redefines itself. And she says, and I agree with this, Mary Ann Glendon of the University of something or other in Pittsburgh, that the only alternative to that in American political discourse is that, well, it's my right to burn the flag. Well, it's my individual right, or it's about free speech or free expression, or it's my flag, I bought it, and I can do whatever I want with it. So there's this kind of conflict between the language of individual rights and true valued choice between individual rights and the right of a community to define and redefine itself through its symbols, which is surely not worthless. I mean, it's such a right of a community. But he wasn't making any political point. He was teaching general semantics. Nevertheless, the little kiddies went home and told their parents what their teacher had done, and the parents were soon in an uproar, and soon the school board was in an uproar. And they searched their souls for quite a while because he was a very effective and popular teacher. But they finally decided that they had no alternative but to fire him for the insult to the flag, for the abuse to the flag. Abuse is a good word, always to use the old lost performative line. According to whom and according to what criteria? Well, we already know how that would have been answered because Mary Ann Glendon told us. So they had no choice but to fire the teacher after having performed such an act in front of the students, no matter what his rationale might have been. Now, this kind of thing continues to agitate Americans. They just can't drop it. And there are many laws at local and state levels which punish flag abuse. And there's this movement in the States for a constitutional amendment that would embed something in the U.S. Constitution that would make flag abuse a federally punishable criminal offense. And the amendment, I think, has come pretty close to passing at certain points, but it never quite got 3/4 of the state legislatures that are necessary to pass an amendment down there. Okay, now what's the point from a general semantics point? Hey, it's not the liberal point. It's my right, it's free expression. And it's not the conservative point of view. Hey, it's the part of the symbolic processes through which a community is constantly redefining itself. Hey, it's about sanity. It's about consciousness of abstraction. So I might even want to impose sanctions on flag abusers at the end of a saner process of deliberation. I wouldn't, but it's plausible that one might want to for certain purposes, in certain contexts, even after a sane consideration of the matter at all the relevant levels. A lot depends on context. Chain index. In a context like this, I certainly wouldn't have fired the high school teacher. In some other context, I don't know, I might have a different attitude if it was my flag. I never quite got the feeling about the American flag as though it was mine. Also, there's another thing, too. The flag is identified directly with self, with one's own body. Directly identified at a depth psychological level with one's own body. So when you go out there and burn somebody's flag, you know, you're not merely expressing yourself, or it's not, hey, we're just protesting. If you're being real about what you're doing and its effects on people, then you realize you're going out there and purposely hurting people with the purpose of hurting them. That's your purpose, whether you recognize it or not. So that's why Norman Thomas, who was the leader of the U.S. Socialist Party, succeeding Eugene Debs, and a Protestant minister, like Debs. I think Debs started out as a Protestant minister. The best socialists are the socialist gospelers. You know, it never fails. Norman Thomas who's the leading presidential candidate of the U.S. Socialist Party in 1,000 presidential elections and always got a healthy 2% of the vote or something like that. He suggested that instead of burning the flag, American protesters should wash the flag in public. Now, if I wash the flag in public, that will arouse, it'll arouse, some emotionally invested semantic reaction, but it'll be quite different because the attribution of the intention to insult or to hurt or to provoke, the intention to make war that's involved in an image like that just simply won't be there. There's this constant debate in the South about the use of the Confederate flag. I don't have a solution other than that if people were trained in consciousness of abstraction, they would have a better handle in terms of sanity on what is going on. Ambrose Bierce defined a flag this way. Have you heard of Ambrose Bierce? Ambrose Bierce. Everyone should know about Ambrose Bierce. He's one of those forgotten geniuses of the 19th century. He's an American journalist who wrote B-I-E-R-C-E, Bierce. Mm-hmm. He was a great writer, and he loved to write short stories and little satirical things. And he went off to cover the 100-year-long Mexican Revolution. They take the revolutions very seriously down there. Lots of blood flowed for 100 years to establish the hegemony of the PRI. He wrote a book called The Devil's Dictionary. You can find it online. Also known as the Cynic's Word Book. My favorite definition there is actually Hebrew. He defines Hebrew as a male Jew, as distinguished from the Shebrew, an altogether superior creation. He defined flag as a colored rag borne above troops, which appears to serve the same purpose as certain signs that one sees on vacant lots in London. Rubbish may be shot here. He's playing with the word shot, which in London means thrown. Rubbish may be shot here, you can throw your rubbish in here. So Bierce is saying, okay, this is heavy stuff around the time of the Spanish-American War and the Mexican-American War. Flag, a colored rag borne above troops, appears to serve the same purpose as certain signs that one sees on vacant lots in London. Rubbish may be shot here. Okay, get it? So, it's thought-provoking. I could say to Bierce, are you talking about my flag? Are you talking about my flag? Anyway, I talked in first term about the host, and the Roman Catholic view of the desecration of the host. That's a related topic, and I defended the Roman Catholic position at that time as a general semanticist, so I won't bother repeating that again. I think if you go out and steal a host from the Roman Catholic Church and a consecrated host, because before it's been consecrated, it's not the body of Christ. But if you steal a consecrated host and stick pins in it, and you want Catholics to know about it, hey, there's some kind of a problem there. It's not enough to just say, oh, it's just a piece of bread. At the object level, it's just a piece of bread. Hey, but, we dwell at the object level, but we're nothing without our label levels as well, and all of our symbolic lives. We don't want to use sanity in order to trivialize things that are emotionally important to people. So again, when you talk about all the problems of the Muslims about the images of the Prophet Muhammad, or my favorite, because it's so subtle, Migros Geneva, which is a toilet paper company in Geneva, Switzerland, has withdrawn 16,200 rolls of toilet paper Arab shoppers had complained that a calligraphy on the paper could be interpreted to spell the word Allah. The toilet rolls in question had been imprinted with star signs, and the Greek sign for virgin could, if upside down, be taken to resemble the word Allah in Arabic script. And so the Migros apologized profusely, and those rolls of toilet paper were withdrawn. What are you saying, Horowitz? Just the facts. I don't know if Islamic religious training is compatible with general semantics training, but I think it is. And the reason I think that is that one year I had 4 religious Muslims taking the spirit course, and they loved it. And they would go out in the middle of the class to pray. I don't know the kind of scheduling the university imposes on people, but and I never could figure out why. And their leader was actually an imam who became a young imam who became quite prominent in the Toronto Muslim community, but I forget his name. I think it was something about the relationship between the Word of God and God's creation. At the top of the structure of the French. Could have been something like that. Allah, Muhammad, Rasul Allah is a form of words about what needs to be wordlessly conveyed in a kind of wordless relationship with one's creator, or something like that. I'm just speculating. But here's the kicker. You remember my story of Amnesty International, by the way, and the power of the use of the word violence? Amnesty International could carry on mock kidnapping after mock kidnapping, and no one would hardly notice. And then all of a sudden, a varsity reporter uses the word violence in a headline, and all hell, to coin a phrase, breaks loose on campus. And Horowitz is told never to do that again. So, what would be better? To think about the use of the word violence and its effect on semantic reactions? Would it be better to deal with that, or would it be better to deal with the debate about whether Horowitz should have allowed that or not, or whether he was condoning violence or not, or whether Amnesty International should be allowed to carry out mock kidnappings or not? Which set of considerations should come first? This is a question which I'm rhetorically raising here. There is a right-wing libertarian website called Strike the Root, which I used to follow. After a while, you know what people are going to say when you follow their thing. The kind of interest falls off because you can predict what they're going to say about anything that arises in the news. But at first, this was a kind of a fresh experience for me to read a right-wing libertarian. It's refreshing for someone who's only read Marxism all his life, or something like that, to look at something different for a few minutes, maybe. So it's Strike the Root. And they're opposed to the form of capitalism we have now because they're pure libertarians who argue for a pure market economy without any state power whatsoever. So they're right-wing anarchists. And their hero is Henry Thoreau. And the Strike the Root comes from Thoreau's, it's a quote from Thoreau, "There are thousands hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." And this is a column by an American Cherokee who writes for them, and he's a conservative Cherokee, imagine that. Well, there were some Cherokees who were slave owners, so I guess now we understand how a Cherokee could be a libertarian conservative. Anyway, he's writing here that he doesn't like the American flag for all kinds of reasons. He hates the Pledge of Allegiance, and he loves America, but he hates all this statist bullshit because he's a libertarian. And there's the usual libertarian stuff about the state, right-wing libertarian hatred of the state. They want to smash the state, too. So this is his solution. His solution is, I envision a flag with a picture on it, because he's talking about this debate about flag burning. So he's saying, here's the solution. I picture a flag with a picture on it of a flag being burned. Now, See, he knows at some level about multi-ordinality. So here we have a flag, and on it there's a picture of the flag in flames. And if anyone does not like my idea, either because the mere existence of a flag seems overly collectivist, or because my flag design is overly cynical and self-degrading, that's fine with me. The great thing is if my flag design ever does catch on and you dislike it, you can burn it in protest. And if you approve of it, you can burn it in adulation. So he wins. Whatever you do, he wins. If you burn it because you dislike it, that's fine, because that's exactly what he's doing. And if you burn it because you approve of flag burning, you're doing what he wants as well. Now that's not as nice as Norman Thomas's advice to wash the flag, but it is in some way saner in my estimation, because it takes account of the multi-ordinality of the levels that are involved here. So let's burn a flag with a picture of a flag burning. That can mean anything. It's way up there, towards the highest label level. A flag for a free country, he calls it. And there he is with his puppy dog, Anthony Gregory, conservative Cherokee. Okay. Is there anything more to say about this bit? Oh yeah, I got to tell you a little story about Korzybski himself, who tells this story not in any of his printed publications. I once ordered a CD of Korzybski's workshop of 1943, which I begin to find extremely boring because, if you think I'm bad, and he just goes on and on and on and on. And the quality of the recording is bad also. But he tells the story of, he had a friend who's a psychologist, and they set up this experiment where he would be given the Rorschach test. Do I have to tell you what the Rorschach test is? I do? Okay, so the Rorschach test was used by psychologists, a lot of psychologists in the 50s, and maybe some psychologists still used it, and it was also used in forensic medicine and law enforcement to try and find out something about the insides of people's hearts and minds. Just abstract designs on paper, and they would show you a set of like 12 images and ask you what you see there, and you would say, you would see all kinds of things in the picture that weren't actually there because it was just a set of squiggles. So it's a way of testing your projections. So Korzybski had the Rorschach test. His psychologist friend brought out the Rorschach test, and also a blood pressure thing. And the idea was they would administer the Rorschach test to Korzybski and at the same time monitor his blood pressure. Now most people, even if they wouldn't admit what they saw in the picture, or even if they weren't consciously aware of what they projected into the picture, they would have some kind of change in their blood pressure. So this is administered to Korzybski, and the Rorschach test is administered, and his line is absolutely flat. He's bragging about this. His line is absolutely flat through the Rorschach procedure. In other words, he's having no reaction to the object level, the pure object level of marks on paper, designs on paper. And then his wife, the Countess, comes in and gives him a kiss, and his blood pressure goes way up. Isn't that nice? Well, bully for you, Alfred. Hey? We should all be like you. All right. Any discussion at all of this bit? Because I'm going to go on next time into the more subtle regions of violence and hatred and all those bad things of which the others are guilty. Yeah.
Question. This is a little while ago, but on the struggle between reason and passion.
Yes.
Were you saying that those are roughly corresponding to the conceptualization of the cortex and the sensory experience of the thalamus, or just that, less than that, that reason and passion play out in the cycle between cortex and thalamus anyway?
I would say something like that. The use of these terms, reason and passion, and their juxtaposition as sort of opposites, is a primitive attempt to approach what we might now today consider to be the relation between cortical and thalamic regions of the brain.
Gotcha.
So one of the things we can derive from Korzybski and from general semantics is that there is no reason per se. That's elementalistic. There is no passion per se. That's elementalistic. So therefore, there's no trade-off or balance between reason and passion. And when we continue to think about this, continuously think about it in those terms, then we're missing the opportunity of thinking it in terms in which let's forget about the terms reason and passion. So if we talk instead about label and object levels or cortical and thalamic levels, those are ugly terms. So we can come up with other terms that are aesthetically more pleasing. But we could come up with a different set of terms other than reason and passion. We could think about this in those terms, and we can use diagrams in the way that I've been trying to use them to illustrate the cortico-thalamic pause, which is at one and the same time cortico-thalamic integration. Now, in a way, Korzybski is holding out, he's projecting an ideal of human sanity, which maybe you would say no human being would be capable of. And he's bragging about himself as being a kind of a paradigm or model of sanity in this little story about the Rorschach test and the blood pressure indicator. But he also admitted that no one can be conscious of abstraction all the time, not even him. And he wrote the book. So he had these moments of uncharacteristic humility. I'm sure we could go farther with the question that you raised. We could talk about the relation, what relation we would want to construct between these considerations and traditional Platonic Aristotelian reason and passion.